back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. Luke Jones, I shared a dude meme the other day, and you and I were talking off the air, and you say that you've abided by all these social rules and norms set forth during your, I don't know, sort of garden variety pandemic here from Pennsylvania down to Maryland. But you were up in Shrewsbury, and, I tell you what, if you're just following the NFL and you're not following these absolute horrific press conferences every day and numbers of dead bodies and things going on in the news, the NFL is still percolating, isn't it, Luke Jones?
It's felt fairly normal. It's not, and certainly the Michael Brockers deal falling through and the complications with not having teams permitted to conduct their own physicals and some of the problems that you deal with there, and the lack of press conferences. I think we all are getting used to conference calls or, I guess, Zoom meetings in the new sports media world. Beyond those challenges, free agency and the start of the new league year has felt fairly normal. And
it's been a normal news cycle other than pro days. I mean, visits as well. Visits are that's the Brocker story, right? Kind of, sort of, right?
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying it is normal, but the free agency part of this has felt fairly, at least familiar.
Well,
right?
teams there are 32 teams all trying to win next year, and they're all conducting business as though there is no coronavirus, right? Like, from a transactional standpoint, they all have to proceed as though there will be a draft in 3 weeks. We will participate. We need to be as prepared as we can be prepared under the circumstances, right? I mean, I'm sure they're Zooming with these kids, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to do as much as they can. I think the draft is a different story as far as, when I say business as usual, we know the draft's not going to be that way. Hasn't been that way for several weeks now. Pro days and 30 official visits, all those different things, they're not happening. So I think that's where, when you're looking at it through the Ravens lens or any other of the 32 teams, you're really counting on the fact that you have scouts, you have coaches, you have individuals within your organization who can really evaluate, who really have good connections across the college football world to get a better read on who these kids are as prospects. I mean, the character part of it's a big thing, but when you can't bring a guy inside your building and get to know them over the course of a day, that's different. So that's where you'd like to think, as a Ravens fan, you'd like to think that, well, the Ravens have a pretty good reputation at knowing how to draft, even if they've had some pockets of time where they've looked a little more average in that way. But if you trust your process, if you trust the way that you go about evaluating players beyond having the luxury of a visit, beyond the luxury of going to their pro day, and really look at the tape and look at the players that were at the combine, and the players who weren't at the combine, like I said, you have all of your networking across the nation to hopefully find out about players that you want to find out about, then you create not a complete picture necessarily, or not as complete as before, but as complete as you can get where you feel good about making a decision. But that it's definitely different in that regard, but at the same time, you have to, you can't feel sorry for yourself because, one, you understand that relative to real-world type issues, this is still something that's not that significant. And two, all the other teams are in the same boat. So you just do the best you can. And as you mentioned, they're preparing for a season. They're preparing for training camp. They're preparing for all those things that, frankly, we'd be disingenuous if we didn't say we're at least uncertain at this point in time. But you still have to prepare. And that's where the Ravens, just like the other 31 teams out there, are trying to do that. And in the meantime, even though the draft is certainly going to be interesting to see how that plays out for all these teams, free agency trying to conduct that business as normally as you can, but certainly the Ravens ran into a pretty significant challenge with the concern over Michael Brockers' ankle. He ends up, re-signing with the Rams. The deal falls through, and the Ravens wind up with Derek Wolfe over the weekend, which I don't think was a bad consolation prize. So,
well, about where they were, right? Let's rewind this, right? The Brockers thing falls apart, and you look up and you say, well, where's Michael Pierce? Where are these other guys? You know, it was very un-Raven-like, and certainly not the way that Eric wants to conduct the offseason, right?
Well, it's un-Raven. I mean, I guess you could kind of say maybe it's not un-Raven-like if you want to just point to what happened with Ryan Grant a couple years ago. But I think what's different here is came down to it. This wasn't the Ravens conducting their own physical. This was an independent physical that was conducted, and Michael Brockers suffered a high ankle sprain in Week 17 last year, and it's not to say that the Ravens think that he has some kind of chronic career-ending kind of condition, but if you have enough concerns about an ankle where you just say, when we look at this, our medical people think this guy might benefit from having surgery. Well, if he has surgery, what does that mean for the rest of the offseason? What does that mean for training camp? What does that mean for the start of the regular season? You just have so many more questions at work here that you don't know. So then when you have some questions and then you look back at that deal and say, well, it was agreed to 3 years, $30 million, $21 million guaranteed. I said to you all along, I liked Michael Brockers, the player. I didn't love the contract. So if you have a physical concern on top of that, then it's a little more complicated. How this is different from Ryan Grant 2 years ago, remember the wide receiver from Washington that they signed, where the deal was panned right away. I mean, it would have been a disastrous kind of overpay because Ryan Grant's just not that good. I still kind of scratch my head at that one.
They wound up giving some of that money to Willie Snead in the end, right?
Well, it was, if you remember, they signed Michael Crabtree a couple days later. Crabtree had been let go by Oakland. So skeptics
I forgot about him.
Yeah.
Jeremy Maclin, he was here too, right? Yeah.
Right.
Just going through the names.
But if you want to look at through a skeptical lens, there was a situation where someone could say, okay, did you have some buyer's remorse? Then Michael Crabtree gets let go a day later, and then, okay, the physical, maybe there was a concern that's where people could be skeptical, even though, I'm not saying that that's what happened, but certainly people could feel that way. I think it's unfair to view this situation in that same way because the Ravens couldn't even conduct their own physical. So there have been a couple other situations where I believe a deal in Jacksonville fell apart. With the Bengals cornerback, Darquez Denard. That was a deal that fell apart, although I haven't heard if that was a physical concern or someone just got cold feet over the financial part. But in this case, they decide to walk away. Brockers returns to the Rams on a deal that includes far less guaranteed money, mind you, and the Ravens wind up with Derek Wolfe, who I'm not going to say is as good of a player as Michael Brockers and hasn't been as durable, but I'd say for the money, and you're talking about a deal for $3 million with some incentives that could take it up to $6 million on a one-year deal. I'd much prefer that, relatively speaking, than the money they were pouring into Michael Brockers potentially. So I think in the long run, the Ravens turn out okay here. I think there's certainly some questions with Derek Wolfe with his durability. He's only played 16 games. I believe it's once in the last 5 years, so there are some durability concerns, which is one of the reasons he was still available. But if you look at his body of work in Denver, the kind of player he's been, really good against the run. Pass rusher, probably not quite as consistent as you'd love, although he had 7 sacks in 12 games this past season. But I think for the price, probably not someone who, if healthy, and if Michael Brockers is healthy, probably someone who's not as far off from what Michael Brockers is going to bring as people would think, just looking at the contract. So I think as much as it's not ideal, and you certainly don't want to be in a position where you're flunking guys on physicals because, that's something that long-term can have some ramifications with agents. I think this was a really unique set of circumstances with what's going on right now. So from that standpoint, I don't think this was the worst thing as far as how it impacts the Ravens for 2020. And I think even if they had signed Brockers, I still would have been talking about a need for them to start adding some youth to that defensive line, which is something they can still do as they get into the second half of the draft the next month.
Luke Jones is here. He is Baltimore. Luke, we're we're talking a little bit of sports, which is sort of weird. We're not doing a whole lot of that. On a personal level, now I've been locked down going on 3 weeks, right? I had Frank Kelly on last week about Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and then I did Sports Boosters, and then it all stopped. It all stopped the night of the NBA and Tom Hanks. Seems like a long time ago. The baseball part of this, the basketball part of this, the hockey part of this, to some degree the football part of this, but they're not supposed to be playing right now. Other than running wind sprints and getting ready for the draft or whatever, we're not in season. But, man, for the in-season things, and I know you're a wrestling fan, there are people out there waiting on golf and horse racing and all these other things that take up our lives, lacrosse, I don't want to forget that. All of it's sort of gone. But baseball wants to come back. The NBA wants to come back. The NHL wants to come back. They're talking about July and August hockey games in Las Vegas. I don't know, Luke. But the notion that these athletes are out there, like I saw one of the hitters hitting balls in a high rise in a batting cage in his condo, and what people are doing. The social media part of this, from a voyeur standpoint, if you are a sports fan, to wonder what 1,000 baseball players and 400 NBA players and 700 hockey players are doing, and their organizations and all of their little pandemic logos, and it's its own thing, right? I mean, I don't know that Sports Center is going to go on, but there are plenty of conversations being had, whether it's Steph Curry sitting and talking to Anthony Fauci on Instagram, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's been plenty of that. There's been lots of, I've seen, even I think Bill Self, Kansas head coach, when the Jayhawks national championship game was being replayed, it was about a week ago. It's funny you mentioned all of this feeling like an eternity. I mean, every day you wake up, it's like, oh, what day of the week?
Dude, is it April yet? I keep asking myself, please.
Yeah, it's very strange.
It's been a long, hard March.
Yeah. I think my favorite meme that I've seen on the internet is, I'm struggling what day, if you're not sure what day it is, it's March the 97th, which just speaks to how long the month has felt like. But it's been very different, and some of the social media has been really interesting. You mentioned Steph Curry with Dr. Fauci. I thought that was a great idea to reach so many people in a arm of social media that maybe the news doesn't do a great job of touching. So I think you've seen stuff like that. You've seen players train. You've seen funny stuff. You've seen situations where players and athletes and coaches have talked about coronavirus and how it's impacted them either directly or someone in their family. I mean, it's been fascinating, sad, uncertain. I mean, so many the full gambit of emotions that you can think of. But you just mentioned it as far as for the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, anything that should be played right now under normal circumstances. It really is going to be so fascinating. Assume their seasons are even able to happen, which I think we'd all be kidding ourselves if we didn't at least acknowledge that there's a very real non-0% chance that that's never going to happen, and it's going to be canceled.
Well, I mean, we had a conversation last week, and I don't even know who I was on the phone. I was talking to somebody, any of the business owners we've had on or local people that I've been talking to, and they said, if there's a Ravens season, and I'm like, I hadn't thought about that. I realize Pearl Jam's gone, and I realize basketball and lacrosse are gone, and I sort of feel like baseball's, because it's what they do. They'll play a 58-game schedule in August and September if they have to, because it's what they do. But I feel like they will play. Man, if we got to a point where there is no NFL this year, and I'll go on my political rant here because I don't do this with you often. This is where these idiots running on the beach in Florida and these idiot governors in Mississippi and Alabama that think it's just going to stop at the county line like Porky told him was going to. It's not going to stop at the county line, and it's just going to stretch things out. And the real concern I have here from a stupidity level of who's running the country is that this is going to linger far longer across the culture than it could, should, or would have if we were running the place the right way. So I'll say that here on whatever March 30th, April 3rd, whenever you're listening to this, to say that if we're playing baseball in July, it's because the country all listened and did what Dude Luke and Dude Nestor did, which was abided. And if people are going to run around, this thing is going to drag out over 180 days as a pandemic that reaches small-town USA sometime 8 weeks from now, in the same way that it has done that in Italy and all sorts of places that every doctor in the world that tells about pandemics would tell you. So this is where the pandemic meets the sports thing, where we all sit here and say, well, if we're not going to follow the rules, we're going to screw this up, and there won't be a baseball season, and there might not be a football season. I'll say this, the only way we're going to have a football season and a baseball season is if we eradicate this and do it the right way, and none of us get sick, right? Literally, and no one on the farm gets sick either.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so complicated. And I mean, we're really, truly in uncharted territory as far as being in this kind of position in this day and age. And it's one thing to get back to a point. And look, I want to be very clear about this. The idea of not having baseball season is absolutely heartbreaking to me. The idea of the NFL season being in jeopardy would be absolutely devastating. So I'm not trying to live in that world, but I'm simply acknowledging that there's a lot of unknown with this. And the timing of this, and medical experts have talked about this, the virus dictates that. Now, where I have hope is we have the greatest medical and scientific minds all over the world on this problem at this point. Now, that doesn't mean you come up with a cure next week, but that does mean you can come up with treatment that can mitigate and improve. And while everyone is social distancing, we can get back to a point where we're talking about sports. But even with that, Nestor, even if we flatten the curve and the numbers start to not disappear, but they start to plateau, and we start to not see as many new cases, and we're not seeing continue to see spikes in death rate, there's still going to be the opposite end of that, and that's where it's going to be interesting to see what happens with sports. I mean, the NBA has talked about perhaps having all the teams in a couple neutral locations and playing neutral site games to finish out the season without fans. I mean, I think Major League Baseball last week passed provisions that they have for the draft and service time and things of that nature, and they put in there that they're going to follow the CDC guidelines, and they, in an ideal world, don't want to start up if they can't have fans, but they put the caveats in there that if it's impossible to have fans, but they can play games that can be on television, and us fans can watch and have live sports to watch, that would be an option that they'd certainly consider. But how does that all work? And I think that's where we're all going through this right now. Even those of us who are completely abiding, following the rules, following the laws, doing everything you're supposed to be doing. And
I feel like I should put my bathrobe on right now and sit here and do this. You know what I mean?
Right. But even if we're all doing those things, we still don't know what the opposite side of this thing looks like as far as easing those things. And okay, maybe it's no longer social gatherings of 10 people, but you talk about 50, and then what's the next step after that? Is that are you allowed to open up restaurants for people to dine and things of that nature, and bars, and okay. But when do you get, at what point, and I don't know the answer to this, and I'm not claiming to have any kind of inside knowledge on this, but when do you get to the point in that recovery process, so to speak? I don't want to say recovery because that, there are people trying to recover from the virus. So, but when you ease back into
economic recovery, right? Societal recovery, whatever that is, right?
Social recovery, let's say. At what point do you get to the point where you say, you can have 71,000 people downtown for a Ravens game. You can have up to 45,000 for an Orioles game, although I'm probably not going to have that issue this year, at least very often, unless you're giving away a bobblehead. But those
the Orioles will be the first thing to open, as I said to my wife as I walked to the city.
Yes. Right, but those are the kind of questions that have to be answered, not just in Baltimore, everywhere. As far as
in St. Louis, people show up.
Yeah, but it's one thing to talk about restaurants and bars and churches and bingo halls and things of that nature. It's a different animal to talk about 45,000 people for a baseball game, or 70,000, or even think college football, 110,000 at Michigan or Penn State.
This is a time where,
like,
you're talking about all these games and stuff, and I'm thinking, I just want to go see Pearl Jam. You know what I mean?
No doubt.
Like, I'm wondering, and maybe out loud, do I miss sports more or, concerts more? Do I miss restaurants more? Or do I miss traveling more? Dude, I miss it all. It's been very evaluative, for me of, the things that I've enjoyed in my life. And as you well know, I've sat and written 4 books in a room by myself. It's a very solitary thing to write, and you're a writer as well. But man, we are social beings, right? We are, even if you're not extroverted, you're more extroverted than you think.
Yeah, and that's a big thing too. I mean, look, I make no secrets that I like being at home. I like being a homebody when I have chances to do that. But it's a little bit different when, like for example, I live in southern York County, Pennsylvania. On Friday, York County was added to the stay-at-home mandate for Pennsylvania. Well, by law, I'm to be at home other than to go out for essential food, pharmacy, things of that nature. And I've been abiding. So it's not like it really changed anything for me dramatically over the last couple of weeks, but it's a little heavier when it's a requirement and not just a guideline, not just something where you're strongly urged to do so. You get into the debates as far as, whether it's law, whether you're, just doing your social, your civic duty to stay home, whatever. But it is a little heavier when, even if you're someone who enjoys being at home, that, well, you're supposed to be at home, and there's nothing to go do anyway. I mean, can't go see a movie. You can't go to a concert. You can't go to a baseball game. So it's been really different in that way. And I think, we've talked about this before. We'll continue to talk about it. For a sports fan who loves sports as an escape, and you think about the role that played with 9/11. You think about the role that Major League Baseball played, staying open and staying going during both World Wars. I mean, you think about the time, the historical context in which sports has been used as an escape, and for that now not to be a reality, at least not in any kind of live, normal way. It's very strange. I mean, it's been funny to me as someone who's still, it's not as though I've just cut myself off from the sports world. I mean, I'm still watching ESPN or MLB Network or whatever, but it's been interesting to see what you have to consume. You have old games, you have 30 for 30 NFL films, documentary type specials. You
can watch that all day. I mean, I have been lost on YouTube concerts like that.
Yeah, sure.
That's been what I've done. I've been cleaning my place. I've fixed up the office. You can't really tell, but I got the lava lamp rocking here. I mean, I haven't shaved. Obviously, I haven't spent any time doing that. Or if you see my hair, I'm going back to the nasty Nestor '94 Brad Pennington look. But, I think we've all I've been TED talking a little bit. Obviously, I've been talking to business owners here on our platform, trying to say, what happens if we don't talk about sports other than you and I, and inviting a friend or two on, that there are no sports to talk about. I think it's a fascinating time that if you've always wanted to watch a football life, you have that opportunity, right? And I'm not a guy that wants to watch old games. I don't get that at all. It's just not my thing. If it's your thing, God bless. My wife was ponying around on Sunday afternoon. She's like, hey, Orioles game's on. You want to watch? And I'm like, no, I don't want to watch. No, I don't.
I'll tell you where I do like old games. And I mean, it's something I've watched old games before. I mean, it's not something I have done a lot.
I did it more when I was younger. I don't.
You know what?
As I get older, I just want to experience new things. I'm a variety guy.
You know what I like about it, and what's been comforting though more than anything is just having it on while I'm doing something else. Whether it's background noise when I'm doing a little bit of reading, related to the sports world. I read a lot of sports writing, obviously. Whether I'm doing my own writing. There's been something comforting about just having a ball game on in the background, and it might even be something I had. I think the 1996 Yankees-Indians opening day was on MLB Network last week, and I just had it on in the background for a while. I wasn't even really watching it.
Now batting, Jeter, number 2,
I mean, just during
Derek
a ball game.
Jeter.
What's been most interesting to me, Nestor, and this is not something that I get at all, but I've seen enough juice for it that it makes me wonder about the future, has been video game simulation. I saw NBC Sports Washington on Saturday, I want to say it was. They had a video game simulation of a Caps game. They had a video game simulation of an NBA. It was Wizards against Lakers, NBA 2K, which, the graphics for PlayStation 4 and the top-of-the-line systems right now are pretty impressive. I mean, you have to look at it for a second, and then you realize, this is a video game. So I don't get that at all. I don't have any. That doesn't appeal to me in the slightest. But I'll tell you what's been really interesting, and I'm not a NASCAR person at all. I have zero interest in NASCAR. But the iRacing Pro Invitational thing that they've done, I was flipping channels late Sunday night, and they had the replay of the NASCAR iRacing. What that is, they have NASCAR drivers literally with the little steering wheel, little simulator thing in their, I assume, their homes, and they're all taking part in a race. And I'll say this, Ness, and look, a diehard NASCAR fan might be cringing hearing me say this, but I turned it on for about 5 minutes. It kind of felt like a real NASCAR race. Now, again, not my cup of tea just because
it felt like a real race when I was in the little thing at Aladdin's Castle at East Point Mall in 1984. You got in the little booth, you drove the car. I mean, I can only imagine what virtual is going to be like as we all grew up on a telephone and TV. You're going to be able to jump into anything you want, and I mean anything you want, right?
Sure, and I'll say this. It's not something you and I have talked about much, and it's still very niche, but e-gaming is a lucrative thing in this country. It really is, and you'd be surprised the number of young Ravens fans who have tuned in to watch Hollywood Brown play a game of Madden on, I think it's called Twitch. I think it's called, it's kind of like a YouTube interactive chat kind of thing where you can watch someone play a video game. And you just wonder about something like NASCAR, where you think about the dangers of racing, and you do wonder 50 years from now if it's all just going to be simulations that people watch, and the graphics and everything will be so pristine that it looks real, but you don't have anyone with the risk of dying in a car in a crash. It's one of the tentacles, one of the arms to this sports shutdown that's been really interesting to me, even if it's not something I personally have wanted to watch. But when I put that on for 5 minutes on Sunday night, and I was kind of amazed that they had their normal commentator, I assume they're normal commentators, talking about it like it was a real race. Like they're not taking it too seriously, but they covered it like it's a real race. And I mean, it was kind of interesting to the point that I watched it for 5 minutes rather than just continuing to channel surf. So that's something that I didn't necessarily think would be part of this, but you've had old games, you've had simulations where people just, a baseball season being simulated by Baseball Reference or various websites, and you read about games that never happened, but it's still coverage of a baseball game in some way. You've had the documentaries, and then you have these video game type simulations that at least some people have been watching. So it's been really kind of fascinating to see how sports fans have coped with this part of not having that escape in your life. I think we've talked about it. I mean, I think we all agree you can't watch the news 24 hours a day. You'll drive yourself crazy. You'll drive yourself mad. You'll
especially
get really
around
angry.
Dinner time. It really sucks between like 5 and 6 usually.
Yeah. So I mean, you need a break. So sports fans, normally their break for this, when you're going through tragedy or challenges or adversity in your life is sports. So how they're trying to consume that, it's been really fascinating, and I'll be interested to see what, however long this lasts, and we hope it's not too long, but again, who really knows? It'll be interesting to see how this all ultimately impacts our viewing habits, how this might impact the sports world in a long-term sense. And like I said, I mean, the video game, simulations and the iRacing, I mean, that's something that I think that might not be something that goes away. I'm not saying that's going to replace sports. Let's be clear. But I've been interested to see there being some thirst to that I just would not have thought there being otherwise. But hey, that's how we learn, man. And different generations have different tastes, and it's been interesting to kind of see that have some share of the sports viewer market as we stand here in going into April of 2020 and knowing we're at least weeks away from having live sports again.
Last thing on the sports thing for me, because, I mean, we're going to be sitting here talking to business owners and whatnot. The sports part of this, of missing it and how much you want it back and when it's coming back, I think for everyone, this is going to be a hyper-local illness. As much as every corner of the country, every corner of the world is going to have infections, infestations. Lots of people are going to know people who are going to die in all of this, especially if 100,000 of us or more, and then we're all going to have a parade for the president because he's done such a great job after 100,000 of us die, that there would be a part where New York right now and what they're going through, and Seattle and what they're going through, and how sort of hyper-local it is, that all of these teams, say Baltimore or New York, and after there's a bombing in Boston at the Marathon, the Red Sox coined Boston Strong, and the first thing we do after 9/11 is we got to go back and play baseball, and there has to be a World Series in New York, and George Bush has to throw out the first pitch, and it's the local part of this, when things get normalized, whenever they get normalized, honor the fallen, getting your community back together, opening the corner store again, everywhere is going to be a local issue. And it's going to be interesting to see how teams and brands and people respond to that. And where and I've said this, watching this clown bumble this every night, it feels to me like the eternal LA Clippers or Cleveland Browns or Baltimore Orioles, for that matter. And then out there is a Cuomo who looks like he's running this thing like, I don't know, like Bill Belichick running a football organization, to use I don't know, Riley running an NBA team, or Phil Jackson, or Nick Saban, or whatever. Something that's well organized, well led. That from a local perspective, different sports teams saying, this is what we're going to do. We've seen athletes step up. We've seen Zion Williamson step up and say, I'm going to pay the Pelican staff, and different people in the sports space doing that. Organizations are going to have an opportunity to do that and be a part of the recovery, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how sports plays a role in that when this thing gets dusted off a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think you've already seen, the number of, it's one thing for teams, and, the Orioles is part of Major League Baseball, $30 million, Major League Baseball, to various organizations, and we've seen the Ravens and Steve Bisciotti make it, but the number of individual athletes, what Drew Brees has done. So many others. He just stands out because because of the amount that he gave. But it is going to be fascinating to see where sports is going to fall in this. It's always, to your point, I think so many people, even if you weren't a big baseball fan, post 9/11, we can all remember baseball coming back. Remember, the NFL had canceled that weekend. College football hadn't gone on. Baseball was kind of the first entertainment industry to, I suppose movie theaters, but something that was tangible as far as something that came back. Baseball was kind of at the forefront there. And I think we can all remember Jack Buck talking in St. Louis. I believe that was on ESPN, giving a little speech at the beginning of the game. But you do wonder, how sports will fit this time around, just because of the sheer challenges of having crowds of tens of thousands of people. But you do hope that it can be a revitalization, and it's something that isn't just, we're here, spend a bunch of money. You hope that there's much more of a fostering, a cultivation of a sense of community, and I think there will be. I think most organizations, most athletes, I think they get that. And I think it's going to be, when we get to that point, as much as we're all dealing with personal frustrations, frustrations with the political process, all those, just the sheer fear of you or your loved one getting sick. Once we're beyond all of those very real, very serious issues, I think we're all just going to be that happy to be able to go to a ball game
and have a beer,
to be able to go to a movie, or to be able to go out to dinner and just. Someone said something over the weekend. Someone in my social media world said, "How much do you just miss the words from a server? Hey, welcome to so and so. Can I get you some drinks and an appetizer to get you started?" Like something as simple as going out to brunch. I mean, so I think sports. It's going to be fun to see how that fits into this entire process, and I can't wait for that day. I don't know when it's going to be. I hope it's sooner rather than later. I know it's not going to be next week. Probably not going to be next month. But we will get to that point again, and I think that's where, these teams, I think, can really play a really special role in that healing process or that return to what we used to know as normal.
Well, we've seen this after 9/11. We've seen this after New Orleans. We've seen this after these things that if Alabama gets to kick the football, that's going to be a big deal in Alabama. And honest to God, if Dundalk High gets to play, it's going to be a big deal. If Susquehanna gets to play, right? I mean, if we get to play anything or go watch and cheer anything, whatever the name is of the hometown, for the heroes in your hometown, for the doctors, for the nurses, for the first responders, for all of that, we're about to go through an internal war here of the likes we had no comprehension of, and clearly the idiot running our country had no comprehension of 3 months ago when he was briefed about it.
Well, we're already in it. I mean, we're not about to. We're already going through it at this point. And I'm glad you brought up Dundalk, or my alma mater, Susquehanna, in Southern York County, PA.
The mighty, they're the Warriors, right?
The Warriors, right?
So get that right. I get that right.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it's one thing.
Do you know what Dundalk is?
I don't.
We're the Owls, the mighty Owls.
That's right. It's one thing to talk about the Ravens or the Orioles or the Terps or Alabama or North Carolina basketball or the Wizards, whoever at the collegiate or the professional level. But it's another thing to talk about Jimmy's Little League team that isn't playing baseball right now. It's another thing to talk about your someone's 14-year-old kid who's not playing club lacrosse right now. I mean, there are.
Well, it just occurred to me, I had Moeller on. Moeller hasn't seen his grandkids in 3 weeks. And it's like lacrosse and baseball season.
And that's where you even get into, let's say, hopefully, if everyone abides to social distancing, and we've seen the curve flatten, we've seen the improvement, we've seen hospitals stabilize in terms of infrastructure and medical supplies and all those things where we're all feeling like we've gotten over the proverbial hump, right, where we've seen the worst of it. Once we get to the other side of that, and as I mentioned, where does baseball being able to have 40,000 people in a ballpark, where does that rank? I would think that's later in the process, but do we get to a point where you could have a summer Little League in June or July and kids be able to play some baseball? And, knowing that that's not going to be a crowd of 500 people, it's going to be, the kids on the field, the teams, and their parents. When we get back to even that point, that's a great time. It's great to think about that. And
can you throw a baseball with a rubber glove on? I'm wondering.
Yeah. I mean,
let's find out.
It's definitely.
I want to play some wiffle ball, Luke. Can I play some wiffle ball?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about the simplest things that you used to do with your friends or with your family that
paper football.
Just not doing right now, and so to
I'm doing yoga. I feel like that's it's the one thing I'm doing. I'm doing yoga and walking a little bit.
I've been doing DDP yoga. I've been trying to get outside, even though some of the rain we had over the weekend didn't make that helpful. But I think it's important to do as much of that as you can. But that human interaction. I mean, and yes, you can do it on Zoom. You can do it on FaceTime. You can do it over the phone. You can do it through text. But just that human interaction, other than the people that you are living with right now that you're not getting, you miss that. So once we're able to do those various activities, I think there's going to be a euphoria to that. I think that we're all going to appreciate things that we just took for granted for such a long time, and I think sports is going to fit into that, and it's going to be fun. I wrote this last week at WNST.net, kind of reflecting on an opening day that wasn't to be. Boy, I can't wait for that first ballpark hot dog when I'm back at the ballpark probably watching the Orioles lose because, we know where they are right now. But, even the thought of that, that brings a smile to my face right now. Just thinking about that first ballpark dog, and we'll all get there eventually. It's just going to be a matter of when.
Yeah, I was singing the Oriole Magic song as I walked past the aquarium the other night. I was the only one out there, and my wife was going to videotape it, but I told her not to, But there was something about like no one out there, and I'm like, something magic happens, and you could hear it all sort of reverberate, and I'm like, yeah, you make the magic happen. All right, dude, rest up. My best to your quarantine partner, your brother, and enjoy your SpaghettiOs or whatever the hell you're doing up there on the farm, and go for a walk. I mean, you have nice outdoor space up there. We're all trapped in the city down here, but we'll continue to check in. You can follow Luke at Baltimore Luke out on everywhere, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. He is Luke Jones. He'll be in Owings Mills whenever they let him come back. We're going to talk sports once a week or until the Ravens pick some football players later on in the month. I'm not going to do a lot of sports around here. I've even changed the logo. I have a pandemic logo for everyone. We are WNST.net. We're keeping calm. We're staying local, and we are Baltimore positive.